For a long time, Europe believed it was living in a protected world. Life was hard, brutal even, but it was predictable. People understood hunger, war, and hardship. They understood seasons that failed and winters that lingered too long. What they did not understand, what they had never truly faced, was sudden, unstoppable annihilation. In the middle of the 14th century, that illusion of stability shattered almost overnight. People went to bed feeling ordinary aches and worries, and woke up burning with fever, their bodies betraying them from the inside. Painful swellings emerged beneath the arms and along the neck. Black blotches spread across the skin. Blood seeped where it should not. Within days, sometimes within hours, entire households were erased. The dead accumulated so quickly that burial itself became impossible. Church bells rang so constantly that eventually they were silenced, not out of mercy, but because there were no longer enough living hands to ring them. Across cities and villages alike, a single question echoed with growing terror: was this the end of everything? What people were experiencing was not divine punishment, not poisoned air, not witchcraft or sorcery, though all of these explanations would be fiercely believed. It was something far more indifferent and far more deadly. They were witnessing the most devastating pandemic in recorded human history. A catastrophe that would kill tens of millions, perhaps more than half of Europe's population, and permanently alter the structure of society itself. This event would come to be known as the Black Death, and once it began, there was no refuge, no safe distance, northwest hiding place. To understand the scale of the collapse that followed, it is necessary to understand the height from which Europe fell. The early 14th century was not an age of decay. It was the peak of medieval civilization. For generations, Europe had enjoyed relative climatic stability during a period historians now call the medieval warm period. Harvests had been abundant. Food supplies were reliable. Populations surged. Towns expanded beyond their ancient Roman walls, growing dense and vibrant. Trade flourished. Markets overflowed with goods. Cathedrals soared skyward, massive stone expressions of confidence, faith, and technical mastery. Society felt ordered, interconnected, and secure in its place under God. Europe was no longer isolated. Through a vast network of trade routes spanning continents, goods flowed from the far edges of the known world into European ports and markets. Silk, spices, precious metals, and ideas traveled across Asia and the Middle East, carried along routes protected by the vast Mongol Empire. This era of relative stability across Eurasia, the Pax Mongolica, allowed merchants to move with unprecedented safety and speed. A trader in Venice could sell goods that had passed through dozens of hands across thousands of miles. Europe had become part of a global system long before it understood the risks that came with that connection. This interconnected world bred confidence. People believed they were progressing towards something greater. They built higher, traveled farther, and traded faster than their ancestors. But the same roads and sea lanes that carried wealth also carried death. The infrastructure that sustained prosperity would soon deliver catastrophe. The world had unknowingly constructed the perfect network for a pandemic. The origin of this disaster lay far beyond the stone streets of Europe, in the vast grasslands of Central Asia. These were lands of extreme climate and endless horizons, where nomadic life had persisted for centuries. In these regions lived an ancient bacterium, one that had evolved long before humans built cities or trade routes. It existed quietly among rodent populations, passed from animal to animal through fleas, rarely disturbing human life. For centuries, it remained contained within this ecological balance. Then that balance broke. In the early 1300s, climatic disruptions, possibly cycles of drought followed by heavy rains, disturbed the rodent populations that carried the disease. As food sources collapsed, infected animals moved closer to human settlements. Fleas abandoned dying hosts and found new ones. The bacterium crossed a threshold it had crossed before, but never at this scale. It entered human trade networks at the worst possible moment, when those networks were more extensive and efficient than ever before. The earliest human victims did not understand what was happening. They experienced violent fevers, vomiting, and unbearable pain as their lymph nodes swelled grotesquely. These swellings, later called buboes, marked the most common form of the disease. Death followed swiftly. Entire communities vanished before warnings could spread. Rumors traveled faster than facts, carried by terrified merchants and refugees. Tales reached the Mediterranean of cities in the east emptied of life, of regions depopulated by an invisible curse. These stories were dismissed by many Europeans as distant tragedies, misfortunes of foreign lands, or exaggerated travelers' tales. No one yet understood that the same trade routes bringing spices and silk were carrying the seeds of their own destruction. The turning point came on the northern shores of the Black Sea, at a fortified port city called Kaffa. This city was a crucial junction between overland Asian trade routes and European maritime networks. It was wealthy, cosmopolitan, and heavily defended. In the mid-1340s, Kaffa became the focus of a prolonged siege by forces of the Golden Horde. For months, the city held out behind its stone walls, supplied by sea and protected by disciplined defenders. Then the plague entered the besieging army. Soldiers began to fall ill in massive numbers. Their bodies darkened, their flesh rotted, and death swept through the camps with terrifying speed. The army was collapsing, not under enemy fire, but under biological assault. Facing defeat, the besieging commander made a decision that would echo through history. Plague-ridden corpses were hurled over the city walls using siege engines. The act was meant to break morale, but its consequences were far worse. Fleas left dead bodies in search of warmth. The disease entered the city. Kaffa was lost, not through military failure, but through contamination. As panic spread, merchants fled. Ships packed with people, goods, rats, and fleas slipped out of the harbor and sailed west. These vessels became floating incubators, carrying death across the Mediterranean. They stopped at ports to resupply, leaving behind invisible passengers. One by one, Europe's great trading cities fell. When the ships reached Sicily, the horror became impossible to ignore. Sailors arrived dead or dying, their bodies covered in blackened swellings. Authorities tried to expel the ships, but it was already too late. Rats scurried along ropes onto the docks. Fleas found new hosts. The city erupted in sickness. People fled, spreading the disease inland. What followed was a cascade. From port to port, from city to city, the plague advanced with terrifying inevitability. Europe's cities were uniquely vulnerable. Narrow streets, overcrowded housing, poor sanitation, and dense populations created perfect conditions for transmission. Waste ran openly through streets. Animals lived alongside humans. Fresh water was scarce. Once the plague entered a city, it spread like fire through dry timber. Mortality rates soared. In some places, half the population died within months. The medical knowledge of the time offered no defense. Physicians believed disease was caused by imbalances of bodily fluids or corrupted air. They prescribed bloodletting, incense, and isolation based on astrology. They advised people to avoid bathing, fearing that open pores allowed poisoned air to enter the body. Every remedy failed. Many made the disease worse. As doctors died alongside their patients, faith in knowledge itself began to erode. Fear transformed society. Families abandoned one another. Parents fled from children. The sick were sealed inside their homes. Social bonds collapsed. Laws ceased to function. Courts closed. Markets stopped. Labor halted. The machinery of medieval life simply stopped running. Silence replaced the noise of commerce and daily activity. Death became omnipresent. Burial practices collapsed under the weight of numbers. Individual graves were replaced by mass pits. Bodies were stacked without ceremony. The living grew numb. Grief became impossible to process at such scale. Faith, the central pillar of medieval life, was tested to its limits. People crowded churches, praying desperately, only accelerating transmission. When prayers failed, despair deepened. Religious extremism surged. Groups of penitents marched through towns, publicly whipping themselves in hopes of appeasing divine wrath. Their rituals spread fear, hysteria, and disease. At the same time, paranoia demanded a scapegoat. Long-standing prejudices erupted into violence. Jewish communities were accused of poisoning wells. Despite official condemnations, mobs carried out massacres across Europe. The plague revealed not only the fragility of human bodies, but the fragility of moral restraint. The countryside did not escape. Villages were emptied. Fields went unharvested. Livestock wandered unattended. The natural world crept back into human spaces. Forests reclaimed abandoned land. Wolves approached settlements. The carefully managed medieval landscape began to unravel. By the early 1350s, the first wave burned itself out. There were simply too few people left to infect. Europe emerged into a transformed world. The survivors faced grief, trauma, and uncertainty, but also unexpected change. Labor shortages shifted power dynamics. Wages rose. Serfdom weakened. Social mobility increased. The rigid hierarchies of the medieval world cracked. Art and culture reflected the trauma. Death became a central theme. Skeletons danced with kings and peasants alike in murals and manuscripts. The message was clear: no rank or wealth could protect against mortality. Society became more questioning, more skeptical, less willing to accept inherited authority without challenge. The Black Death did not end civilization, but it forced it to evolve. It stripped away illusions of control and permanence. It demonstrated that progress carried risks as well as rewards. The world rebuilt itself, altered by loss and shaped by memory. Centuries later, the echoes remain. Empty streets, fear of contact, suspicion of the air itself, these are not relics of a distant past. They are reminders of how fragile systems can be when confronted by forces beyond human control. The Black Death was not just a medieval catastrophe. It was a stress test of civilization itself. And like all such tests, its lessons were written in suffering. The plague did not simply kill millions. It changed how humanity understood life, labor, faith, and power. From the ruins of that devastation emerged a new world, less innocent, more resilient,